On the morning of August 1st, 1867, a quiet hay-cutting camp 2.5 miles from Fort C.F. Smith in Montana Territory erupted into chaos. Out of nowhere, around 500 Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors charged down the hills, their war cries piercing the air, followed by the sharp crack of gunfire. The 21 U.S. soldiers and 9 civilians at the camp, caught completely off guard, dropped their tools and sprinted toward a fortified corral, their hearts pounding as they glanced back at the wave of warriors closing in. The sight was nothing short of terrifying, a massive, coordinated assault that seemed to promise certain defeat. This was the start of the Hayfield Fight, a brutal clash in the heart of Red Cloud's war, a fierce struggle between native tribes and the U.S. Army over control of the Bozeman Trail, the critical path to Montana's gold fields. Days earlier, Crow scouts, allies of the U.S. Army, had warned the camp of a large native force gathering nearby, but the soldiers and civilians brushed it off, confident they were safe. That overconfidence and their failure to heed the Crows' warnings set the stage for one of the most intense battles of the frontier, where survival would hinge on quick thinking, new technology, and sheer determination. To understand the Hayfield Fight, we need to step back to the broader conflict known as Red Cloud's War, a fierce struggle from 1866 to 1868 that pitted the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho against the U.S. Army. This war was all about the Bozeman Trail, a vital route cutting through native lands to reach Montana's gold fields. The trouble started heating up in December 1866 with the Fetterman fight near Fort Kearny, where Chief Red Cloud's alliance ambushed and wiped out 81 U.S. soldiers, led by Captain William J. Fetterman. It was a stunning victory for the natives, proving they could outmaneuver the Army and boosting their confidence sky high. That battle also exposed a big weakness in the U.S. arsenal. Their outdated muzzle-loading muskets, which took forever to reload, left soldiers vulnerable to the natives' lightning-fast attacks. The winter that followed was brutal for the U.S. Army at Fort Kearny. Food ran desperately low. Most of their horses and mules starved or froze due to scarce forage, and scurvy ravaged the soldiers, leaving them weak and demoralized. Plans for a winter campaign to strike back at the natives were scrapped. They simply didn't have the resources. Meanwhile, the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho, after dispersing into smaller groups for the winter, came back strong in spring 1867. They launched a series of raids along the Bozeman Trail, hitting Fort Kearny and Fort C.F. Smith. These attacks were more like quick jabs, small scale, with few losses on either side, but they kept the Army on edge. In July 1867, Red Cloud gathered about 1,000 warriors in Rosebud Valley for the Sundance, a sacred Lakota ceremony that also served as a war council. This powerful gathering united the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho, fueling their resolve to resist U.S. expansion. Disagreements led to a split. The Cheyenne and Arapaho, with some Lakota, targeted Fort C.F. Smith, while most Lakota and a few Cheyenne aimed for a hay-cutting crew near Fort Kearny. At its core, Red Cloud's War was a fight against U.S. expansion into the Powder River Country, a region promised to the Crow under the 1851 Fort Laramie Treaty. The U.S. building forts like C.F. Smith on Crow land and pushing the Bozeman Trail through native territory was seen as a direct violation of that agreement. For the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho, this wasn't just about land, it was about protecting their way of life. The stage was set for a showdown, and the Hayfield Fight was about to become a pivotal chapter. In the summer of 1867, Fort C.F. Smith was a bustling outpost in Montana Territory, tasked with protecting the Bozeman Trail and supporting U.S. expansion. One critical job at the fort was cutting and drying grass to feed livestock through the harsh winter months. This wasn't just busy work. Without hay, the fort's horses and mules would starve, crippling operations. To keep the hay cutters safe, the Army built a fortified corral 2.5 miles from the fort. This sturdy setup measured 100 by 60 feet, surrounded by thick log walls laid on the ground, with a lattice framework above for extra protection. Trenches were dug at each corner for defensive positions, and inside, there were tents for the workers and a picket line to secure livestock. Just outside, 3 rifle pits offered additional cover for guards. It was a solid defense designed to hold off any trouble, or so they thought. The fort's location on Crow land, guaranteed by the 1851 Fort Laramie Treaty, brought another key player into the mix: the Crow tribe. The Crow had long been rivals of the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho, who had pushed them out of their territory in the 1850s and 1860s. Seeing the U.S. Army as a shield against their enemies, the Crow allied with the fort, settling nearby to trade goods and gain protection. Their scouts became the Army's eyes and ears, and on July 12th they delivered a chilling report. A large force of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors was gathering in Rosebud Valley, about 50 miles east of Fort C.F. Smith. It was a clear sign of trouble brewing, but the warning didn't seem to shake the fort's confidence. That confidence got a boost on July 23rd when Lieutenant Colonel Luther P. Bradley arrived with 2 infantry companies, swelling the fort's garrison to 350 soldiers. More importantly, these troops came armed with the latest firepower: breech-loading Springfield Model 1866 rifles. Unlike the old muzzle-loading muskets from the Fetterman fight, which managed only 2 to 3 shots per minute, the Springfield could fire 8 to 10 rounds in the same time. This was a game-changer, giving soldiers the ability to keep up a steady stream of fire against fast-moving attackers. The Army was clearly learning from past defeats and gearing up for a fight. But at the hay-cutting camp, that sense of urgency was missing. On the day before the battle, Crow scouts rode in with another warning. A large band of Red Cloud's warriors was closing in. The 21 soldiers, led by Lieutenant Sigismund Sternberg, and the 9 civilians working the fields, brushed it off. Maybe they thought the Crow were exaggerating, or maybe they felt secure behind their corral's walls. Whatever the reason, they ignored the alert, a decision they'd soon regret. The morning of August 1st started like any other. After breakfast, 10 civilians and a mounted escort loaded wagons with hay and headed to Fort C.F. Smith, part of their daily routine. Back at the corral, 21 soldiers and 9 civilians stayed behind. Sternberg split his men, posting some on the nearby hills as lookouts and others at the corral to guard the workers. The civilians spread out into the fields, scythes in hand, cutting grass under the summer sun. It was business as usual, with no hint of the storm about to break. Ignoring the Crow's warnings wasn't just a one-off mistake. It reflected a deeper U.S. tendency to underestimate Native intelligence and strategy, a flaw that had cost them dearly in Red Cloud's war and would soon be tested again in the Hayfield Fight. Just past 9 a.m. on August 1st, 1867, the peaceful hayfield near Fort C.F. Smith exploded into chaos. From the hills, around 500 Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors descended with blood-curdling war cries, their voices echoing across the valley, followed by the sharp crack of gunfire. The 21 U.S. soldiers and 9 civilians in the field froze for a split second before panic set in. Tools dropped, and they bolted for the fortified corral, their boots pounding the dirt as warriors on horseback closed the gap. Lookouts on the hills, already sounding the alarm, scrambled back to join their comrades. It was a desperate race for survival, with the corral's log walls as their only hope. The warriors moved fast, seizing the 3 rifle pits just outside the corral in a matter of moments. These pits, meant to give the soldiers an edge, now gave the natives strategic spots to fire from, pinning the defenders down. Inside the corral, Lieutenant Sigismund Sternberg rallied his men, ordering them to take cover behind the sturdy log walls. As the warriors charged closer, Sternberg gave the command to fire. A volley of bullets ripped through the air, catching the attackers off guard and breaking their tight formations. Some warriors fell, others scattered, but they quickly regrouped, thinking they had time to press the attack while the soldiers reloaded. What the warriors didn't know was that the soldiers weren't using the slow, muzzle-loading muskets from past battles like Fetterman. Instead, they wielded breech-loading Springfield Model 1866 rifles, capable of firing 8 to 10 rounds a minute. Before the natives could close the distance, the soldiers reloaded in seconds and unleashed a second volley. The rapid gunfire was a shock, sending the warriors into disarray as bullets tore through their ranks. Chaos erupted on the battlefield, with native leaders shouting to rally their men, who pressed forward despite the unexpected resistance. The Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho were fierce fighters, but their weapons put them at a disadvantage. Most carried bows, arrows, and war clubs, tools perfect for swift, open warfare, but less effective against a fortified position. A few had rifles, but ammunition was scarce, limiting their firepower. Their usual tactic, charging hard to overrun enemies during the long reload times of muskets, fell apart against the Springfield's speed. The soldiers, crouched behind logs, kept up a steady stream of fire, making it nearly impossible for the warriors to breach the corral. This opening clash set the tone for the Hayfield Fight. The technological gap between the U.S. Army's new rifles and the natives' traditional weapons shifted the battle's momentum early on. It was a stark contrast to the Fetterman fight just months earlier, where slow muskets had spelled disaster for the Army. The soldiers' ability to adapt, armed with better tools, gave them a fighting chance. But with 500 warriors circling, the corral was still a long way from safety. The battle was only beginning, and the defenders knew they were in for a brutal day. As the Hayfield Fight raged, the situation inside the corral turned dire within minutes. Lieutenant Sigismund Sternberg, the man in charge, stood tall behind the log walls, directing his soldiers with the confidence of a seasoned officer. With experience in both the Prussian and Union armies, Sternberg was no stranger to battle, but he clung to a strict European military code. Refusing to fight prone like his men, he believed it improper for an officer to lie on the ground. That decision cost him dearly. In the opening volleys, a native bullet struck him down, killing him instantly. Another soldier fell beside him, leaving the defenders reeling from the loss of their leader just as the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho pressed their attack. Sternberg's death was a brutal wake-up call. He'd only been at Fort C.F. Smith for a week and had no experience facing native warriors, whose hit-and-run tactics were unlike anything in European warfare. His rigid approach, standing exposed in a hail of arrows and bullets, made him an easy target, and his loss threw the corral into chaos. Sergeant James Horton, next in line, stepped up to take command, barking orders to keep the men focused. But Horton's leadership was cut short when a native shot tore through him, leaving him severely wounded and unable to continue. With 2 leaders down and warriors circling, the 20 remaining soldiers and 9 civilians faced a grim reality. They were on their own. In that moment of crisis, a civilian stepped forward to save the day. D. Al Colvin, possibly named Alvin C. Colvin, a hay cutter with experience as a Civil War veteran, took charge without hesitation. He wasn't an officer, but he knew how to fight. Calm and decisive, he assigned each man a specific spot along the corral's defenses, ensuring every angle was covered. His clear-headed leadership steadied the group, turning a panicked crew into a disciplined fighting unit. Colvin's ability to rally the men mirrored other moments in Red Cloud's war, like the wagon box fight a day later, where ordinary soldiers and civilians rose to the occasion when officers fell. With the warriors' initial charge faltering under the rapid fire of Springfield rifles, the natives pulled back briefly, giving the defenders a precious moment to regroup. Colvin seized the opportunity, ordering the men to strengthen their position. Soldiers and civilians grabbed shovels, digging deeper trenches at the corral's corners to shield themselves from gunfire. They also piled dirt into nearby wagon boxes, creating makeshift barriers to stop bullets and arrows. It was grueling work under the August sun, but every scoop of earth made the corral a tougher nut to crack. The respite didn't last long. From the creek just 30 feet away, native warriors took up positions, their arrows and occasional rifle shots zipping into the corral. This constant harassment kept the defenders on edge, unable to rest or even think about retreating to Fort C.F. Smith. The gunfire was loud enough to carry the 2.5 miles to the fort, yet no help came. That silence from Fort C.F. Smith weighed heavily on the men, who began to fear they'd either die in the corral or face capture, a fate many dreaded more than death. Colvin himself, despite his steady command, voiced their darkest thoughts. "We'll never get out of here alive." The contrast between Sternberg and Colvin couldn't have been starker. Sternberg's formal, inflexible tactics, rooted in European battlefields, were no match for the fluid, unpredictable style of native warfare. Colvin, on the other hand, adapted to the moment, using his Civil War experience to keep the defenders alive. This clash of leadership styles highlighted a broader truth about Red Cloud's war. Survival on the frontier demanded flexibility and quick thinking, not just rank or tradition. With Colvin at the helm, the corral held firm, but the battle was far from over, and the warriors outside were already planning their next move. With their initial charges thwarted by the corral's defenses and the rapid fire of Springfield rifles, the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors regrouped on the hills, their leaders plotting a new strategy. Unable to break through the log walls, they decided to use the environment against the defenders. Around mid-morning, the warriors launched a bold plan to burn and smoke out the 20 soldiers and 9 civilians trapped inside. Charging from the south and east, they unleashed a barrage of flaming arrows, each one trailing sparks as it arced through the air. The dry August grass caught fire instantly, and soon flames roared up to 40 feet high, licking at the corral's edges. Thick smoke billowed across the battlefield, stinging the defenders' eyes and choking their lungs. It was a terrifying sight, and for a moment it seemed the corral might become a fiery trap. Under the cover of smoke, the warriors pulled off a daring move. Creeping as close as 12 feet to the corral, they risked their lives to drag their wounded and fallen comrades back to safety. The defenders, squinting through the haze, could barely make out the shapes moving in the smog, their rifles less effective in the confusion. The natives' plan was clever. The fire would force the soldiers and civilians to flee the corral, exposing them to attack or suffocate them if they stayed put. But nature had other ideas. Just as the flames edged closer, a sudden shift in the wind blew across the field, scattering the smoke and snuffing out the fire. The towering blaze collapsed, leaving only smoldering patches of grass. The warriors' strategy, so promising moments before, had been undone by a stroke of luck. Frustrated but undeterred, the warriors launched another charge, hoping to capitalize on the defenders' shaken state. They surged toward the corral, arrows and bullets flying, and this time their attack drew blood. 1 soldier fell dead, and 2 others were wounded, their cries adding to the tension inside the corral. But D. Al Colvin, the civilian now leading the defense, kept his men steady. The soldiers returned fire with their Springfield rifles, the rapid volleys cutting through the attackers and forcing them back once again. The corral held, but the cost was mounting, and the defenders knew they couldn't let their guard down. As the morning wore on, the battle settled into a tense stalemate. The warriors, realizing a direct assault was too costly, shifted to long-range sniping from the creek, just 30 feet away. Arrows and sporadic rifle shots peppered the corral, keeping the defenders pinned down. Every move outside the log walls risked a deadly hit, and any hope of retreating to Fort C.F. Smith, 2.5 miles away, was out of the question. The constant pressure wore on the men, who were already exhausted from the heat and the relentless pace of the fight. Around noon, the warriors eased their attack for a brief moment, pulling back slightly from the creek. Seizing the chance, Colvin sent a few brave soldiers to dash 30 feet to the creek and refill their water barrels. In the scorching August heat, water was as vital as bullets. The men moved fast, dodging stray arrows, and returned with barrels sloshing full, a small victory that lifted spirits. Back in the corral, the defenders used the lull to dig their trenches deeper, piling more dirt into wagon boxes to block incoming fire. Each man also made a grim decision. They set aside 1 bullet, a last resort to avoid capture if the natives overran their position. Capture, they feared, could mean a fate worse than death. The warriors' use of flaming arrows was a stroke of ingenuity, adapting their traditional weapons for a siege-like assault. It showed their ability to think on their feet, turning the grassland into a weapon. But the wind's sudden shift revealed how much chance could sway a battle, balancing the natives' creativity against the defenders' stubborn resilience. Inside the corral, the soldiers and civilians clung to their defenses, their water barrels full and their rifles ready. But the warriors weren't done yet. The Hayfield fight was far from over, and the next move would test the defenders' endurance to the limit. As the afternoon sun beat down on the hayfield, the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors prepared for another push against the corral. Around mid-afternoon, they launched a fierce assault, charging with renewed determination. But the defenders, now led by D. Al Colvin, were ready. Bolstered by their recent water resupply and a grim resolve to hold the line, the 19 remaining soldiers and 9 civilians fought back with everything they had. Their Springfield Model 1866 rifles blazed, sending volleys that cut through the attackers and forced them to retreat once more. The corral's log walls and dirt-filled wagon boxes held strong, proving too tough for the warriors to crack. Running low on ammunition for their rifles, the warriors shifted tactics. They turned their bows and arrows on the corral's livestock, targeting the 22 mules tied to the picket line inside. In a calculated move to cripple the defenders' mobility, they killed 2 mules and wounded 17 others, leaving the animals dead or writhing in pain. It was a harsh blow, as those mules were vital for transporting hay and supplies, but the defenders stayed focused, their rifles keeping the warriors at bay despite the loss. During one of these charges, a pivotal moment shifted the battle's tide. A warrior, possibly a medicine man or chief, was struck down by a soldier's bullet. His comrades halted their attack, risking their lives to carry his body back to their lines. This pause disrupted their momentum, and the sight of their fallen leader seemed to shake their resolve. Many warriors began to pull back, carrying their wounded across the hills, signaling a possible end to the assault. But the natives weren't done yet. Sensing an opportunity, the warriors regrouped and launched a final attack, this time targeting the corral's south face. Unlike earlier mounted charges, they advanced on foot, slipping through the willows along the creek to mask their approach. Colvin, sharp and experienced, saw it coming. He quickly reinforced the south wall, positioning his men to hold the line. The warriors emerged from the dense brush, crossing the creek and charging across a small open patch toward the corral. Colvin held his fire, waiting until the attackers were fully exposed. Then, at his signal, the defenders unleashed a devastating volley. A key warrior, believed to be a chief, fell dead, along with several others. The attack crumbled, and the surviving warriors retreated, melting back into the hills with their wounded in tow. Amid the chaos, Private Charles Bradley saw a chance to get help. Breaking from the corral on horseback, he galloped toward Fort C.F. Smith, 2.5 miles away, with warriors hot on his trail. Dodging arrows and gunfire, he pushed his horse to its limit and made it to the fort, breathless but alive, to report the desperate situation. Around 1 p.m., another soldier, Lieutenant Edward L. Palmer, whose full name remains uncertain in some records, added to the alarm. While guarding a wood wagon train, he spotted the battle from a nearby hill and raced to Fort C.F. Smith. He told Colonel Robert Murray that the corral was under attack by 500 to 800 warriors, a daunting number that underscored the defenders' dire odds. Murray, the fort's commander, hesitated to act, still scarred by the Fetterman fight, where an overconfident force was lured into a deadly ambush. He feared a similar trap. The memory of that disaster weighed heavily, making him cautious to a fault and delaying critical relief for the corral. The defenders, trapped in the corral, had no idea help was delayed, and the lack of relief deepened their sense of isolation. Finally, at 4 p.m., Murray sent a small force of 20 mounted soldiers to investigate. But a mile from the corral, they were attacked by warriors and forced to retreat. Realizing the gravity of the situation, Murray reinforced them with a full company of soldiers, backed by a 12-pounder mountain howitzer, a mobile cannon with a fearsome reputation. The relief force pushed forward, skirmishing with warriors along the way, and reached the corral at dusk. By then, most of the natives had already withdrawn, their repeated losses sapping their strength. The soldiers fired a single howitzer shot, its thunderous boom echoing across the valley. The sound alone was enough to scatter any remaining warriors who were unfamiliar with the weapon's power and intimidated by its blast. The corral was secured, and the exhausted defenders, soldiers and civilians alike, prepared to move. By 8:30 p.m., they reached Fort C.F. Smith, fending off sporadic attacks from warriors who shadowed them through the darkening hills. The howitzer's role went beyond its single shot. It was a psychological weapon, its roar signaling the Army's strength and unnerving the natives. Murray's delay in sending help, though cautious, had put the corral at risk. revealing the tough balance between protecting the fort and saving outposts. For the defenders, the arrival of the relief force was a lifeline, pulling them back from the brink after hours of relentless fighting. The Hayfield Fight was over, but its intensity left a lasting mark on all who survived it. As the echoes of the howitzer faded and the corral fell silent, the defenders, exhausted and shaken, took stock of their survival. The Hayfield Fight had pushed them to the brink, but they'd held on. The toll was stark. 3 U.S. defenders were dead, Lieutenant Sigismund Sternberg killed in the opening minutes, and 2 soldiers who fell in the relentless assaults. 4 others were wounded, their injuries a testament to the ferocity of the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors. For the natives, losses were harder to pin down. They carried away most of their dead and wounded, leaving estimates of 18 to 23 warriors killed, with several injured. Some accounts suggest up to 30 deaths, but the exact number remains unclear due to their careful retrieval of casualties. The heavy cost of their repeated charges was undeniable. The battle's end didn't mark a pause in the conflict. Just 1 day later, on August 2, 1867, another group of Lakota and Cheyenne warriors struck near Fort Phil Kearny in what became known as the Wagon Box Fight. Like the Hayfield Fight, it was a brutal clash where U.S. soldiers, again armed with Springfield Model 1866 rifles, held off a larger native force. These back-to-back engagements showcased a shift in U.S. tactics. The rapid-firing Springfields, combined with fortified positions like the corral and wagon boxes, gave the Army an edge they lacked in earlier defeats like the Fetterman Fight. The lessons of past failures were starting to pay off, making it harder for native warriors to overwhelm their defenses. Yet the Hayfield and wagon box fights were only chapters in the larger story of Red Cloud's war. Despite their losses, the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho showed no signs of backing down. Their resolve fueled a relentless campaign against U.S. forts and the Bozeman Trail, keeping the Army on the defensive. The pressure paid off in 1868 when the U.S. government, worn down by the costly conflict, signed the Fort Laramie Treaty. This agreement forced the Army to abandon Fort C.F. Smith, Fort Phil Kearny, and other Bozeman Trail outposts, handing a rare victory to Red Cloud and his allies. It was a moment of triumph for the natives, proving their ability to resist U.S. expansion. But the peace was fragile. The Hayfield Fight, though a U.S. victory on the ground, didn't weaken the natives' determination. Their fight to protect their lands and way of life continued, setting the stage for future conflicts. Less than a decade later, the Great Sioux War of 1876 reignited tensions, with battles like Little Bighorn showing the same fierce spirit that drove the warriors at the Hayfield. For the soldiers and civilians who survived that August day in 1867, the memory of holding the corral against overwhelming odds lingered, a gritty testament to their endurance, but also a reminder that the frontier's struggles were far from over. The Hayfield Fight of August 1, 1867, was a vivid snapshot of Red Cloud's war, revealing the stark clash between native tribes and the U.S. Army. The Springfield Model 1866 rifles were a game-changer, their rapid 8 to 10 rounds a minute fire stopping the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho's swift charges. Unlike the Fetterman Fight's slow muskets, the Springfields, paired with the natives' reliance on bows, arrows, and scarce rifle ammunition, tipped the scales, showing the Army's growing technological edge. Leadership defined the corral's survival. D. Al Colvin, possibly named Alvin C. Colvin, a Civil War veteran haycutter, took charge when Lieutenant Sigismund Sternberg and Sergeant James Horton fell. His practical tactics, assigning positions and fortifying defenses, outshone Sternberg's rigid European approach, which cost him his life after just a week at Fort C.F. Smith. Colvin's flexibility proved that adaptability, not rank, was crucial in frontier combat. The U.S. made a costly error by ignoring Crow Scouts' warnings of the gathering native force. This dismissal, a recurring flaw in Red Cloud's war, underestimated native strategy and nearly lost the corral. Meanwhile, Colonel Robert Murray's hours-long delay in sending relief, haunted by the Fetterman Fight's ambush, left the defenders isolated, revealing the lasting trauma on U.S. commanders. The Hayfield Fight captured a cultural clash. native guerrilla tactics against U.S. firepower and fortifications. Though small, it drove the Army to refine its tactics, as seen in the wagon box fight a day later. Yet the natives' unyielding resolve forced the U.S. to negotiate the 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty, abandoning Bozeman Trail forts, a rare victory for Red Cloud. The battle's grit foreshadowed the frontier's ongoing struggles, setting the stage for conflicts like the Great Sioux War of 1876.